November 1988. Saturday the 19th, morning, approximately 10:15. The Californian city of Hayward was immersed in the usual pre-holiday bustle, with Thanksgiving just around the corner. Cars moved slowly through the streets, adults planned the menu for a large family dinner, and children enjoyed a sunny weekend free of lessons and homework. Everything looked so mundane and safe that it never occurred to anyone to look closely at the details of this morning. Two small steps separated ordinary childhood joy from the eternal darkness that descended on the quiet neighborhood in a matter of seconds. Two 9-year-old girls, best friends, ran out of the house holding their bright children's scooters. Their names were Michaela Garecht and Katrina Rodriguez. They just wanted to get to a small local grocery store called Rainbow Market, located just 200 or 300 meters away on a neighboring street. They laughed, discussed some of their secrets, and dreamed of buying sweet soda and candy. It was the simplest, most innocent thing imaginable on a Saturday morning. But at that very minute, around the corner, darkness was already sitting inside an old car. The predator calmly watched the girls approach the trap he had prepared, with the cold-blooded precision of a mathematician. He knew that a child's intuition is silent when the sun is shining around. Who could have known that an ordinary Saturday walk would forever divide the lives of these children, turning one into an eternal ghost from missing person posters, and the other into the sole witness of a horror she would carry inside her for more than 3 decades. What happened in the next few minutes would shock the entire country, but the most terrible part lies elsewhere. The answer to the question of who did it had been resting on the iron handlebars of a child's scooter since day one, in the form of a tiny, blurred smudge that could not be read for 32 years. 32 years of silence, guarded by a fatal, absurd mistake by the men in uniform who refused to hear the voice of a child. If this terrifying picture and the helplessness in front of an indifferent system ignites a fire inside you, if your sense of righteousness demands answers, stop right now and leave a comment under this video with just one word: justice. Because it was this very word that served as the sole guide for those who spent 32 years searching for the truth in a dead end. The girls left their scooters right at the entrance of Rainbow Market. They went inside, cheerfully picked out their sweets, paid at the cash register with small coins, and walked out into the street holding their bags. They headed back home, talking animatedly and completely forgetting about their rides. Only after walking about half a block did the girls suddenly remember they had come on scooters. They turned around and ran back to the store's parking lot. The sun was still shining brightly, people were walking around, but as the friends approached the doors, they noticed that one scooter was missing. Someone had moved it. Michaela looked around and noticed her scooter further back, in the depths of the parking lot, next to an unfamiliar car. It was a trap, a deliberate, cold-blooded bait. An unknown man had intentionally moved the child's toy closer to his door, anticipating that the child would come closer, entering the danger zone where no one would have time to react. Michaela, suspecting nothing wrong, approached the car and bent down to pick up her scooter by the handlebars. At that moment, the car door flew open. A man leaped out of the interior. He acted with lightning-fast brutality. He grabbed the 9-year-old girl by the waist and threw her onto the back seat while she tried with all her might to scream for help. Katrina stood just a few steps away and saw everything with her own eyes. Many years later, as an adult woman, she would say that this moment was forever frozen into her memory. She heard her best friend scream, looked up, and saw the stranger forcing Michaela into the back of an old, light-colored sedan. Katrina just froze in place, paralyzed by severe psychological shock. She was 9 years old. She watched her only friend being taken from this world in broad daylight, right in front of bystanders, and there was nothing she could do. The car accelerated sharply, tires screeching against the asphalt, and the abductor disappeared heading south, pulling onto the busy Mission Boulevard highway. But this was only the beginning of the horror that unfolded in the city. Katrina ran back to the store as fast as she could, crying and begging for help. One of the counter clerks immediately grabbed the phone and dialed the emergency services. The clock read 10:23 in the morning. Just 8 minutes had passed from the moment the girls left the store with their candy to the call to the police. 8 minutes. Criminology books state that the first 48 hours after a child's abduction decide everything. This is the golden window when the chances of finding a person alive remain high. Every wasted minute drops the probability graph to 0. And this is exactly where the system that was supposed to protect made its first fatal mistake. The store clerk who called 911 was trying to be helpful, but she hadn't seen the actual moment of the abduction herself. She hadn't seen the man who grabbed Michaela. Instead, she recalled another driver who had been loitering in the parking lot earlier that morning, and in a state of panic, merged two different appearances into one. She confidently described a man to the operator as being about 30 years old with a thick mustache, supposedly driving a dark burgundy-colored car. The dispatcher logged these words, and from that second, the entire investigation went down a false, dead-end path. An official BOLO bulletin blasted across all police radio frequencies. Look for a 30-year-old man with a mustache in a burgundy car. This phantom, who never existed, filled newspaper pages and television screens. For 2 consecutive days, thousands of patrol officers, volunteers, and agents searched for a ghost. While the real predator calmly distanced himself from the city, law enforcement chased a shadow created by a frightened woman's mistake. Meanwhile, sitting on a chair at the police station was little Katrina, the only witness who had looked into the abductor's eyes from a distance of just a few meters. She tried to tell the truth. She cried, tugged at the officer's sleeves, repeating that everything was different. But nobody wanted to hear her voice. The 9-year-old child was simply brushed aside, her testimony dismissed as the product of childish imagination and fright. The detectives were too busy working the official lead about the burgundy car. The details that emerged later made even seasoned detectives shudder when they finally thought to look into the notepad containing the child's recorded words. The description Katrina had given from the very first minute was radically different from the official lie. The girl described a young guy who was just over 20 years old. He had dirty blonde hair falling down to his shoulders and a very thin build. His face was covered in deep, prominent scars from a severe case of teenage acne. His skin appeared pitted and pockmarked. But most importantly, his eyes. Katrina described them as very cold, narrow blue eyes, resembling the gaze of a predatory fox. The car also had nothing to do with the color burgundy. It was a massive, old American sedan of a cream or pale gold shade, with a severely dented front bumper, as if from a serious accident. The vehicle looked old, dirty, with traces of cement on its sides. 2 completely opposite portraits. One, a fictional phantom, the other, an exact reflection of the real monster. And the system chose the phantom. Renowned journalist Dennis Oliver, who dedicated many years to this case, would later state without any sugarcoating that the police handed the abductor 48 hours of total freedom on a silver platter. The entire vast resource of the state, helicopters, roadblocks, media attention, all worked into a void. The window of opportunity slammed shut forever, and by the time detectives finally caught on and began printing the correct composite sketch based on Katrina's words, time was lost. Michaela had vanished without a trace. Stop here for a moment and think about this. What a terrible psychological trauma was inflicted on a child who not only lost her friend, but also found herself in a situation where the entire adult world refused to believe her at the most critical moment of her life. Michaela Joy Garecht was a remarkable girl. Her mother, Sharon, always described her daughter with one word: light. She was a bright, cheerful child who loved life. That morning, she was wearing a t-shirt with a large Metro logo across the chest, simple blue jeans with rolled-up cuffs, black shoes, and unusual feather-shaped pearl earrings. These articles of clothing would later become sacred to her family, the last material remnants of a girl who just went out to get candy. In those years, the city of Hayward was considered a quiet, working-class place where parents safely let their children go to the store on the next street. Michaela's abduction completely shattered that sense of security. This was a period when the entire country was experiencing a real collective fear over the disappearance of minors. The faces of missing children began to be mass-printed on carton milk boxes sitting on every breakfast table across the United States. Horror stared back at people from every carton during their morning coffee. And Hayward suddenly realized that this darkness had come to their streets too. The search operation was staggering in scale. During the first year alone, investigators followed up on more than 5,000 different leads. In a single day, volunteers and relatives put up 42,000 flyers featuring Michaela's photograph. The Federal Bureau of Investigation took to the skies with planes and helicopters, combing the hills, forests, and abandoned mines around the San Francisco Bay Area. The story made the front pages of national publications and appeared on famous television shows about unsolved mysteries. Even legendary athlete Joe Montana made a public appeal begging for the child's safe return home. A massive reward of tens of thousands of dollars was posted for any information, but it was all in vain. At the end of December 1988, the local police leadership was forced to admit a bitter truth. They had exhausted thousands of leads, but the only thing they achieved was ruling out the wrong theories. They hadn't come a single step closer to solving it. They didn't know where she was, who took her, or if she was even alive. It was convenient, far too convenient, to think that the criminal had vanished without leaving a single trace. But in the parking lot outside the store remained a single object belonging to Michaela: her childhood scooter. When forensics examined it in the lab, they discovered a tiny fragment of a fingerprint on the iron handlebars that did not belong to the girl or her relatives. It was the killer's physical calling card, his tattoo of shame, left on the metal at the exact moment he moved the toy to create the bait. The answer to the case's central question had been kept in a police safe since the first week of the investigation. But the technology of 1988 was powerless. This print was partial, accounting for at most 10% of a full human fingerprint pattern. The computer systems of the time simply couldn't find a match based on such a small fragment. They lacked enough points of comparison for an accurate analysis. Therefore, this ironclad piece of evidence was simply locked away in an archive box for a long 32 years. Michaela's family found themselves on a terrible emotional roller coaster that lasted for decades. This is a special kind of torture known only to the relatives of the missing. Every few years, a new name would appear in the press, bringing a new hope for a resolution, which would then come crashing down against a wall of dry facts. The first on this list was a man named Tim Bindner. He was a highly bizarre, destructive individual who possessed a morbid obsession with missing girls' cases. He would show up at search sites himself, hang around volunteers, write strange letters to the victims' mothers, and try to put himself at the center of media attention. He was suspected in the abductions of several children in California, and an entire book on forensic psychology was even written about him. Yet, despite all his ominous behavior, detectives never found a single piece of real evidence or connection to Michaela. He turned out to be nothing more than a mentally unstable manipulator who fed on other people's grief. If this story touched you, if the fate of this girl became even a little bit important to you, share this video, because every person who learns about her path is another voice in defense of her name, another step toward ensuring that such tragedies never go unanswered by society. Then, in 1992, the family received a new emotional blow. An inmate in an Indiana prison named Roger Hayward claimed that he was the one who kidnapped the girl and knew where her body was buried. He named a specific location, a gladiolus field in Union City. For Michaela's mother, this was yet another stage of hell. She allowed herself to believe once again that she could at least bury her child according to Christian tradition and put an end to this unbearable uncertainty. The criminal was flown to California under the escort of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For 8 consecutive hours, excavators and police officers with shovels dug up the earth in the specified field, while Hayward contradicted his own testimony and constantly changed locations. Eventually, he broke down and confessed that he had fabricated everything from start to finish. It was the cynical lie of an incarcerated manipulator who simply wanted a free trip to another state, media attention, and a temporary easing of his prison regimen. The court added another 6.5 years to his sentence for obstructing the investigation. But for Michaela's family, it brought total devastation. Hope turned to ash once more. By 1994, the number of checked leads surpassed 15,000. 15,000. And then, silence again. In 2009, the country was shaken by incredible news. A girl named J.C. Dugard, who had been abducted 18 years prior, was found alive. She had been kept captive in a backyard by a religious fanatic named Philip Garrido. Michaela's case flared up on the front pages again. The fact was that Garrido had been released from prison just a few months before Michaela's disappearance and lived very close by. The method of JC's abduction was identical. She was forced into a car in broad daylight in front of witnesses. Michaela's mother began to believe again that her daughter might be alive somewhere, that she had grown up in captivity and would soon return home. The Hayward police tore apart Garrido's entire house and yard, conducted dozens of forensic tests, but found no trace of Michaela's presence there. Another dead end. The most horrifying episode in this gallery of false suspects occurred in 2012, when a notorious California serial killer named Lauren Herzog committed suicide. His partner, who was on death row, wrote a letter to a newspaper claiming that Herzog closely resembled the composite sketch of the man who took the girl near Rainbow Market. Katrina, who by then had become an adult, looked at the photograph of the deceased maniac and shuddered. She said his facial features, those cold eyes, bore an uncanny resemblance to what she had seen in her childhood. Police initiated a large-scale excavation of an old abandoned well in a rural area where these killers had been dumping their victims for years. From the depths of the well, thousands of small fragments of human bones were pulled out. Experts stated that the remains belonged to at least 5 different people. 5. The forensic examination lasted for several months, and Michaela's family lived in a state of daily nightmare once again, awaiting the results of the deoxyribonucleic acid analysis. But the geneticist's verdict was negative once more. The bones belonged to another missing girl, 19-year-old Kimberly Billy. Yet, at the bottom of that same well, they found a pair of Mary Jane-style children's shoes, the exact same kind Michaela was wearing on the day of her abduction. A detective tried to gain access to this footwear for testing, but local police from the other county refused to hand over the physical evidence to the Hayward investigators for unknown reasons, and that line of inquiry simply dissolved into thin air. They didn't know back then that they were searching for a ghost who had never figured in the loud headlines of the television news. The real monster was not a media star. He didn't do interviews or write letters from prison. He was an absolutely unnoticeable element of the criminal underworld who had already been behind bars for other crimes for a long time, but no one had ever connected him to a little girl and her scooter. While detectives dug up fields and wells, the truth continued to rest quietly in a box labeled 10% print. The turning point in this story came from a completely unexpected direction, and therein lies the greatest irony of fate. In 2018, a group of detectives from the neighboring city of Fremont was working on solving another cold case from 1986, the brutal murder of two best friends, 18-year-old Michelle Xavier and 20-year-old Jennifer Dew. Two friends who died together. It was a strange, dark echo of Michaela and Katrina's story. Thanks to modern genetic analysis methods and the testing of old biological traces, the Fremont detectives traced the evidence to a man who was already serving a life sentence in San Quentin State Prison. His name was David Misch. When law enforcement pulled up this inmate's full dossier, it took their breath away. David Misch turned out to be in prison for the murder of a woman named Margaret Ball, which he committed in the city of Hayward in December 1986. This happened just 1 month after Michaela Garecht's abduction, on the very same streets, in the exact same neighborhood. The predator hadn't fled anywhere. He had stayed in the city, continued to hunt people, and the system knew his name, but for 30 years, no one had bothered to connect these dots into a single picture. Detectives began verifying records of Misch's whereabouts in November 1988 and found witnesses who clearly confirmed, on the day of the girl's abduction near Rainbow Market, this man was in that very neighborhood. And this is where the description given by 9-year-old Katrina 32 years ago takes center stage once again. The description that police had dismissed as a childish fabrication. In 1988, David Misch perfectly, down to the smallest details, matched the child's words. He was just over 20 years old, had long, dirty blonde hair down to his shoulders, a thin build, deep scars from teenage acne on his face, and narrowed blue eyes. He drove an old, large, light-colored American-made sedan with a damaged bumper. The child had been right from the very first second. She had described the killer with the precision of a professional sketch artist, but the adults in uniform decided they knew better and spent 48 hours looking for a mustachioed man's burgundy car. If the system hadn't been paralyzed by that initial mistake made by the dispatcher, David Misch could have been detained that very evening, and Michaela might have returned home alive. But this was only the beginning of the final breakthrough. Detectives retrieved that same fragment of a fingerprint from the scooter's handlebars out of the archive safe, which for 32 years had been considered a useless piece of metal. They uploaded this 10% of information into modern forensic computer software that had learned to reconstruct missing lines using complex mathematical algorithms and innovative scanning systems. The program processed the microscopic trace and yielded an unequivocal result. The print on the scooter fully, 100%, belonged to David Misch. The exact same fragment that AT Science couldn't read finally spoke the killer's name. On December 21, 2020, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Hayward police leadership called an urgent press conference. They officially announced to the entire world that the Michaela Garecht case was closed. David Misch, who was 60 years old by that time, was hit with official charges for the abduction and murder of the 9-year-old girl, as well as for the elimination of those two friends back in 1986. 3 deaths of young girls lay on the conscience of a single man who had passed through the system unnoticed. His criminal past also revealed an arrest for assault with a deadly weapon prior to Michaela's abduction, but the law had released him on bail each time, allowing him to continue his hunt. County District Attorney Nancy O'Malley stated that this arrest demonstrated the inevitability of punishment, but for the girl's family, This justice turned out to be bitter and incomplete. The fact was that after the new charges were brought forward, David Misch displayed absolute cold-bloodedness. He completely refused to cooperate with the investigation. He said nothing. He did not name the location where he hid the child's body. He did not utter a single word of regret or remorse. He simply chose a tactic of total silence, taking his final, most terrifying secret with him to his prison cell. The police got a name, the court got a guilty verdict, but the girl's mother never got an answer to the main question of her life. Where is my daughter? Michaela Garecht's body has not been found to this day. 32 years of massive searches led to the killer's name, but failed to bring the child home, even just to lay flowers on her grave. The details that emerged later in the life of Michaela's mother, Sharon, show the full depth of the human tragedy that stands behind dry FBI reports. This woman dedicated every second of her existence to searching for her daughter. She did not give up for a single minute. She created and personally maintained a dedicated internet blog where she reminded the world about Michaela every day so that her face wouldn't fade from public memory. Every year on November 19th, the anniversary of the abduction, Sharon would come to that same Rainbow Market store and tie a bright yellow ribbon to a tree growing near the parking lot. Over 3 decades, this tree turned into a silent monument to human grief, completely covered in old and new ribbons that served as a reminder of the child's absence. In 2013, when 3 girls were found alive in Cleveland after many years of captivity, Sharon gave an emotional interview. She said that this news gave her a breath of fresh air. She confessed that a massive black hole yawned in her life, one from which it was impossible to escape day or night. But she continued to believe that her Michaela would one day open the front door of the house. When she received the call from the police in December 2020, informing her of David Misch's arrest, that fragile hope died. Sharon wrote her final, most painful blog post. She said that for 32 years she had always imagined her daughter alive, growing up somewhere, fighting, or simply living. And the hardest thing for her turned out to be recalibrating her mind and, for the first time, imagining her little girl dead. Dead. Having remained in that parking lot back in 1988. But even in this moment of absolute darkness, this woman found the strength to address people with a remarkable statement. She begged society not to turn Michaela into a dry number in criminal statistics or into another successful case study of genetic analysis. She pleaded for her to be remembered as a living, vibrant girl who wore a t-shirt with the word Metro and pearl feather earrings, who loved life, laughed, and simply wanted to buy candy with her best friend. Sharon was never able to hold her child again, or even learn where her remains rest. In May 2022, she passed away from a severe form of oncological disease. She left this world, leaving the central question of her life unanswered. The Federal Bureau of Investigation still maintains a $10,000 reward for any information that helps locate the girl's remains, as the surviving family still hopes to bring her home. This story does not have a beautiful ending with flags and the triumph of the law. It leaves behind heavy questions for a law enforcement system that, due to its own overconfidence and unwillingness to hear the voice of a 9-year-old witness, lost its only real opportunity to save a human life. The child's ancient instinct saw the truth, but the darkness proved stronger than the indifference of adults. Take care of the ones you love and trust your feelings. See you in the next investigation.